The report has 77 recommendations, and they span from everything from how politicians should approach the issue all the way down to what the Department of Juvenile Justice should be doing. We also made some recommendations that were perhaps slightly outside of our terms of reference, including one for suggesting that the Commissioner for Children and Young People in New South Wales conduct a review of the relationship between police in New South Wales and young people. What was perhaps most important is how we framed those options and about how government might respond to them and what they might do about it. And I'll talk some more about what those options were and what it meant. A government response has been positioned or put out there, and again I can probably talk about that a bit later. What was interesting with what we found, I'll say that we came to this project with little or no knowledge of juvenile justice. We'd worked with policing agencies, policing services across Australia, but not actually specifically in this part of the Justice's portfolio. What struck me quite quickly, and the team, was that juvenile justice agencies are at the end of the line. They are truly downstream. They are dealing with things that go wrong or issues or problems that start higher up the line or the stream and flow down to them. They're in an enviable position is my view, and how they therefore deal with things is very problematic because the root causes of issues are often well outside their control. This was probably no news to the audience here, but offending behaviour is marked by social disadvantage. It became quite clear when we analysed statistics, reports, that kids that get caught up in the juvenile justice system are from very disadvantaged backgrounds. Hardly any middle-aged kids, middle-class kids caught up in the system, and most of them are from areas that are marked by strong social disadvantage. How does that manifest itself? Firstly, mental health. I must admit I was appalled to see the figures around for those particularly children and young people incarcerated with mental health problems. Substance abuse is probably no surprise there. Another disturbing factor was the issue of intellectual disability, and the large numbers of children and young people who have an intellectual disability or are borderline intellectually disabled. And in the introduction to the report, we actually position that, are we treating a health issue through justice means? And I'd say that that's had some fierce debate from the disability community in our discussions with them about our findings, but I think this is an important issue for policymakers to look at across Australia. The issue of homelessness, again, no surprise. The issue of exclusion from school or being disconnected from schooling and education, also a very important factor. In reviewing all of this and looking at what we did, one of the things that I saw when we took a very strategic view of it is that it's about dysfunctional families. Families that are dysfunctional are ones that lead to kids getting into trouble. And this, I think, is an important thing for us to bear in mind when we look at this issue. This is a diagram out of the report, and it came up quite early in the work that we did. It contextualised for us very clearly what the issues were around responding to our terms of reference and also how it should perhaps be addressed. The first level, I think, is actually really important, and that's around the political context. Few jurisdictions in Australia have a bipartisan approach to juvenile justice. We're loath to make comparisons between jurisdictions in the report, and I don't think that we do anywhere in a meaningful way, because every jurisdiction's circumstances are different. But one thing that we did point to in there is that Victoria enjoys good bipartisan support around juvenile justice. And I think that this is important. And it goes back to that second of those key questions. The first of those, are kids important? If we say the answer is yes, then we need to treat them in a way that makes sure that we don't turn them into a political football. And I think that we've seen that in different jurisdictions across Australia. We had a look at the legislation, and in New South Wales, the issue of bail and the Bail Act came to the fore. And again, looking the issue that we've pointed to in the report is that the Children's Criminal Proceeding Act actually doesn't take precedence over the Bail Act. And so I mentioned collateral damage. Changes to the Bail Act mean that children and young people in New South Wales have become collateral damage because legislation that's been really meant for adults, and we have no comment on that, actually means kids are being caught up. The significant jump in the incarceration rates for children and young people in New South Wales almost solely attributed to those increase in the remand numbers. That's a problem because the evidence actually quite strongly points to the fact that locking kids and young people up is not good for them. Now, why is that? Because they're dislocated from families, they're dislocated from education. Invariably, these kids are on the edge of being in school or they're actually out of it. It makes it even harder. Perhaps the most disturbing fact from a justice perspective is that a very small percentage of these children and young people go on to get custodial sentences. So we're actually punishing them often for things that are outside their control. An example of that might be that they're homeless. So they're homeless and they've been locked up because there's nowhere for them to reside. And that's, from a fairness perspective, I don't even think it holds up. It's interesting how we look at children and young people, nationally or by jurisdiction. We believe, although the government begged to disagree in its response, there is actually no strategic approach to children and young people in New South Wales. We think there's a need for that. One thing, again, for this audience is no surprise, kids that are kept busy and active get into less trouble. And I think that if states actually take that approach of how do we make sure that our kids are being looked after, that we're keeping them active and healthy and all those sorts of things, and that we take a whole of government approach and whole of community approach, and I'll refer to these a bit more, then we're going to get better outcomes. This bottom line really represents the continuum of risk and people and children and young people getting into trouble. Most of us focus in here, that is, kids that have got are making an appearance before a magistrate and then go to community and control orders. But we think there's a lot of effort needs to go back in here, and I'll talk some more about that. The other issue is what happens when we've got children and young people coming out of custody to stop them reoffending. That reintegrating is a really important area of effort and focus, we believe. It's no surprise, if you refer back to my comments about disadvantage, that Indigenous children and young people are significantly overrepresented in every jurisdiction in Australia. No one beats the Northern Territory and Western Australia, but again in New South Wales, the levels there are very significant, with about 50% of incarcerated children and young people being of Indigenous background.